The artists aren't making the last choice. They're the last approval. They don't get the final check mark on this thing. It goes to some freaking guy in an office wearing a suit who doesn't freaking know anything we think and who we complain about behind his back. Like, that's what's happening there, right? So I released a video on Monday giving my thoughts on the demo for Unicorn Overlord. Yeah. You were saying you wanted to play it now.
Oh my gosh, that game looks so good.
It's really awesome.
I can't believe it. I do wonder though. I do wonder if the name of the game is going to hurt the sales, right? Does that make sense?
I thought the same thing. It's kind of got that whole like triangle strategy and Octopath Traveler like name convention.
What is this about?
Yes.
Right?
I agree 100%. It's
After
a weird name.
Seeing your video, I'm thinking, holy crap, this is going to be the best game ever made.
Yeah.
And I'm shocked at how good it looks. And I'm just questioning why they went with that name.
Yeah.
And I'm sure there's a reason, but there's always other reasons to change names.
To not have that name. I mean, the unicorn is like the insignia or like, what do they call that? Not insignia, the heraldry, the family
like
emblem
a crest
of like the main character's royal family.
Okay.
So that's cool. That's where fine. The unicorn comes from. An overlord, I would think, would just be some kind of like
an emperor,
giving you an idea that it's like a tactical kind of like you're controlling units in battle kind of thing.
Makes me think that you're trying to become the Lord of the Unicorns, and that is like the point of the game, right?
I had the same reaction to the name.
Yeah.
I didn't think it was good because it's not good, but it's a really, really good game.
Oh yeah.
Everyone should try it out. If you haven't seen the video that I posted, the demo is like really, really big. It lets you play for up to like 8 hours. So it's not like a lot of other games where you play an hour and just get this little taste, and then you actually play the game beyond that, and you go, oh, well, I didn't understand it was going to go that direction or whatever. You'll have a really sound idea of what this is after playing it for 8 hours. So I loved it. Nice. I definitely recommend downloading that demo and playing it and seeing if it's for you or not. But one thing I didn't get into in that video, because I didn't really want the video to be focused on this, was the translation and localization from Japanese into English. This is something we have talked about quite a lot in the past on our podcast, but there was a thread on Twitter that I found because Yasumi Matsuno got involved in the conversation in the thread. He was talking about Japanese to English localizations, translations. He actually someone ended up asking him if he liked the War of the Lions version of Final Fantasy Tactics more than the original version, and he said yes, he likes the English version and the War of the Lions version better.
He's my kind of guy.
So, but he said some other really interesting things, and we'll get into that here in the thread. But I just wanted to run this by you because obviously you have a love for languages, and not even just for learning languages, but using that as a vehicle to understand the culture of where that language originates.
I almost feel like you have to do that. Like to really understand the culture, you have to know the language.
Yeah.
Unfortunate fact for some people to hear, maybe, but that is my current opinion.
Well, I agree, because you don't really understand the language unless you understand the culture, and vice versa. They go hand in hand.
Yeah.
And so, you know, we've talked about in the past, and let me just get this out of the way, I guess. If you're a person who's really kind of on the side that you don't want any alteration if you can help it, from a Japanese script to English. You want to know exactly what they're saying there.
Yeah.
That our bias in this is we lean the other direction.
Yeah, we tend to.
However, I want to look at this as fairly as possible.
Well, I'm very sympathetic to people
who feel that way.
Because in many times when I'm learning a language in particular, it's very frustrating when I'm learning a language for the translations to not have been a one-to-one match, because then I end up thinking one word means the wrong word.
Yeah.
Right. And it screws me up and I hate it and it should never happen. But then when I'm not learning a language, I'm like, you know what? It would actually be smoother if they used like an American colloquialism instead of like just transliterating the Japanese, you know? But as soon as I start learning the language, I hate all of it and I want it to go away because I'm learning the language and I'm in a unique position where I'm trying to, understand all of the words. And if they use a different word in the translation than was originally spoken, I'm like, why? Why do that? Right? Yeah. So I kind of see both. I got my foot in both worlds there.
Yeah, and I want to, make that clear too. Like, there are a lot of examples where these people have legitimate gripes. Like, by making this particular change, you have dramatically altered the way I understand that character or something, right?
Okay.
Or they are coming across in a way that sort of betrays what the intention for that character is. So
I've seen examples of that.
Yeah, I don't want to make this out to be like, these people who lean this way never have like a valid sort of like gripe in this regard. However, I do think that a lot of people who are, I don't know I don't know what the right word is for this, who are very into like Japanese anime and just kind of that sort of subsection of the Japanese culture, I guess, and they consume a lot of that media. They tend to have a real passion for it that I think is really awesome.
Yeah, yeah.
But at the same time, I'm not. Again, this is not for everyone. I'm not. Some people live in Japan or know the language, but I think a lot of people are maybe learning it or just beginning on that journey.
Right. So on the Dunning-Kruger scale, they think they know more than
And that's not even just about knowing more in terms of knowing what the words say. You might know exactly what the words say.
Yeah.
But even me in the last 2 years as I've been learning Portuguese, right? And I still have a long way to go. I'm nowhere near fluent. But it's been interesting to see how they just in their culture, we talked a lot about this in our Arrival episode.
Oh, yeah.
So if you haven't seen that, you might want to go watch that because that movie is fascinating in this regard too.
From a linguistic perspective.
Yes, because language actually informs culture and the way you see the world.
Oh, yeah.
Maybe not in exactly the way the movie was portraying
the safer wharf theory,
Yeah. However, it still does. And so that's why
it's
a valid point anyway. But, just the fact, for instance, that in a lot of other Latin derived languages, they have masculine and feminine for almost every
in fact,
word.
Most languages do in the world. English is actually kind of strange, but similar to Japanese in that the gendered language doesn't really exist as much.
So just as an example of that, a person from that culture might see an object like a bridge as a feminine object or something, whereas we would never conceive of that, right?
I wouldn't say never. I wouldn't say never.
Sure.
You're right.
Hashtag
not. Overtly, like consciously, no, you're right. Consciously, no. But I think it evolved in those languages for a reason, and that most languages have kind of like gendered ways of referring to nouns through some like subconscious processes that where we really are kind of seeing the world in a way like that.
Yeah.
But we don't notice it as English speakers. We don't notice it at all. We don't think about it.
Yeah. Well,
but if you've ever hold on, there's this one point because I thought about this a few days ago, and I'm just going to bring it up now, just because. Have you ever been around somebody who likes to make the "that's what she said" jokes a lot?
Sure. Yes.
Usually a younger male. Once you've been around, or if you have been that person, which for a little bit maybe I was, probably back in junior high, you kind of start to realize that, whoa, it's actually kind of hard, especially when you're around that person, to formulate a sentence where that cannot be said.
Yeah, I know exactly what you mean.
And that's kind of what I mean when I say, that aspect of the language exists. And we just don't really think of it. But at certain times and certain people are really good at bringing that out in really awkward and sometimes funny situations.
Sure.
But it's there. It's still there subconsciously. And not until you're a teenager are you like, oh my gosh, the word. It's like a masculine feminine thing.
Yeah.
It's funny.
Well, and even in languages that are very, say, related, like Spanish and Portuguese, they have a different, like agua, water, the word for water is the same in both languages, but it's el agua in Spanish and it's a agua in Portuguese. So it's
Interesting.
a feminine word in Portuguese, a
Well-
masculine word in Spanish.
There is, I
So-
think, there is a little bit of a caveat to that, though. It is El Agua, but I think that's only because they don't like to have the two A's right next to each other.
Yeah.
So it is El Agua, but I'm going to look this up right now. I believe when you're referring to in the plural, it's Las Aguas.
Las.
Yeah. And so they would actually recognize that word as being
a feminine word.
but because of the awkwardness of La Agua having to have that stop there,
Yeah.
they just switched it to El Agua.
But there are examples between other languages, whatever, where a certain word might be masculine in one language, but
Yes.
feminine in another.
Well, a good example,
things like that.
in the Germanic languages, the sun tends to be feminine and the moon is masculine.
Yeah,
whereas
it's opposite.
in the Latin languages, the moon is
Great example.
feminine and the sun is masculine.
Great
But-
example.
And it's all levels of perspective as well as to we refer to Mother Earth, right? That's Gaia.
Yes.
That's the Latin and the Greek. But in Egyptian, the land is masculine. It's Geb, and then Nut is the sky, and
Yeah.
it's like the Nut is a female,
Right.
and then Geb is a male, and Geb is the. And so but it depends on what level you're kind of like focusing on, right? Are you focusing on, at which scale are you looking at it at?
Yeah. So that's just one sort of small example of many, many different things, like a whole like litany of things that would make one culture sort of perceive the world and things in the world differently than another. So even though they might be using these words, so it's Las Aguas.
Yeah, it's Las Aguas.
And that's actually
It's-
really interesting.
Yeah, it's just because it's the letter A.
They don't like having the next to the
Yeah, it just makes it awkward.
Okay, good point. If David had been here, he would have told me that too. Sorry, he knows Spanish and I know more Portuguese. I know a little bit of Spanish.
I'll be learning Portuguese in a few years, though.
Anyway, language tends to color our perception of the world around us. And so while they might be using these words technically, it still might to their culture mean something more like this as we would perceive it here.
Right.
Because if we used those exact words, it would actually mean something a little different than what it means to them.
And you would lose that
Right.
aspect of it. Yeah.
So
yeah, totally.
in those cases, it's actually better to alter it in order to get closer to the meaning that was
Right.
intended. Right.
Yes, good point.
And these are things that I think, people just learning a language, just learning about a culture, have not grown up there. They won't know those nuances. And so it's important to note that if you're not like an expert Japanese linguist who has spent many, many years in that culture, there's very likely, and I'm saying this as a person who, this is the same for me. I don't know a lot about it either.
Right.
All I'm saying is that I would trust somebody who has studied Japanese a long time and lived in that
and
culture.
works in the field. And
More so than somebody who's a really big fan of anime and is sort of on their own, learning the language and studying it. Maybe they've been doing it for 5-10 years or whatever. But
maybe they're really good.
Still not the same as like being ingrained in that culture for years and years and years and really knowing what they mean by that when they say it. Right. So I want to make that as sort of the first point of this, that sometimes even when we're looking at, okay, this is what it says in Japanese, why did they do it this way? It's not, there could be many explanations. One of them could be those words mean something different to them than it does to us, like I just explained.
Yeah.
It could be they're directed to change it on purpose. A good example of that would be Yasumi Matsuno in Vagrant Story. Even though in Japanese, the text is very sort of modern, more straightforward and basic and simple, he told the English localization team to make it sound more biblical on purpose. He wanted them to do that.
Which was the right choice. But what you're saying is top down.
Yes.
It wasn't so much the translators. They were told what to do.
Yes.
And then they, spit it out. But it's not their fault when things kind of get lost in translation.
Or if there's, if we were to look at, and I did this in my Vagrant Story review that I did a while back, I did a comparison in a certain scene between what they say in Japanese and what they say in English. And the difference is, and this is what we're going to see a lot for Unicorn Overlord, they make allusions through metaphor in English to what the Japanese is saying.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
that's just how people spoke in this sort of Victorian or early modern English time.
Yeah.
Like they had a much larger vocabulary, first of all.
Yeah.
Well, maybe it's
Maybe
more
the
difficult to make that claim.
the peasants may not have, but the
Yes.
books written during that time
Correct.
were written very well. We'll just say
Yes.
that. Like they used a wide vocabulary and all types of alliterative, metaphors and all of that stuff.
Yeah.
It was very, very high level.
Yeah. And so when they're trying to make a point about something, instead of just like making the point directly, they would kind of use language almost like artistically to bring up this analogy or metaphor that like paints the picture. It's not actually that dissimilar to, say, the New Testament, where Jesus never just tells you the principle.
Actually,
He
that's
tells
true.
a story,
Usually
a
not, yeah.
parable to illustrate the principle.
Right. And then he says, he that has an ear, let him hear, right? That means like if you get it, you get it. If not, like that's okay,
Right.
But you don't get it. That's fine.
So he was never just like, hey, you need to know this thing.
Yeah.
The end. He was like, let me tell you this parable of this
A wise
person who
man
went and
once.
did this.
Yeah.
And so that's a longer example of what I'm talking about, but people would do that in sort of smaller, much more contained little analogies. And then the other person might take that and spin off of that and sort of like change the context of it to in a witty way make a point back. That's what's called a conceit. We've talked about that a lot, and Vagrant Story is full of that.
Yes.
And the Japanese
And they're
version
fun.
is not at all. The Japanese
More
version
straightforward.
has almost none of that.
Interesting.
And so, but that was directed from Yasumi Matsuno himself.
Right.
He wanted them to do that in English. Yeah. Now, I have not spoken to Yasumi Matsuno about this. I would love to at some point in the future if he would be willing to. But I assume the reason for that is because the equivalent to that sort of medieval sounding English that we see in a lot of our fantasy media for Japanese would be what the samurai spoke during the Edo period or something like that, right? But the problem is Japanese has evolved so far past that point that people today cannot understand that Japanese.
Yeah.
Like you were saying.
Yeah, it's hard. The kabuki.
The kabuki theater.
They need a translator. They need every Japanese person will have a little earpiece for their Japanese play that they're watching, and their earpiece is translating whatever they're watching into modern Japanese.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's very difficult to understand for the average Japanese person.
So imagine that. Like imagine if we couldn't understand Shakespeare. It's maybe you could argue that the media literacy
Things might be getting there.
at this point in time, like maybe a lot of people can't. But it's not to that same degree where
Not
you have to literally have it translated.
This is more like Beowulf or something, right?
Yeah.
Like you're hearing Beowulf, and that was only as different as it is because of the French invasion and all that.
Dude, this just reminded me of the funniest freaking thing I've ever seen. So my brother sent me this video. It's a comedian who is doing a Zoomer translation of a Bible passage. Like a
I've heard
modern
these before.
age translation.
Yeah, but like
a super modern,
Yeah,
as in
super modern.
like the Zoomer, like the Gen Z, Gen Alpha.
I've seen
version
there's
of
a whole
this.
translation of the Bible that is the whole Bible translated as this.
That's what he's reading from, and it's hilarious, dude. Because
that's great. I love these.
And it almost makes this point. It's, you can see how far English has evolved from that point to this point. I could see it to be where it maybe another 100 years or so.
Yeah, it's
people
like
can't
Shakespeare.
read the King James Bible anymore. They just don't understand it.
Yeah, I think that's coming.
And Japanese is already at that point. Is kind of what I'm saying, which is why they don't write in that ancient form of Japanese to make it sound more like the time period or something. They don't do that for that reason. But
they do have a type of
most
samurai Japanese. It's more like Edo period, though. It's more like 1800s Japanese.
But we tend to, for the most part, still be able to understand, partly because a lot of our literature dates back to like Shakespeare and is revered and has been sort of like read and studied in school.
It's like a foundation of it all.
And so like we still have a lot of that. But okay, let me look this up, dude. Hold on.
So he said, baby girl, chill. God sent me to tell you you've passed this vibe check. and low-key, he wants you to have the main character. She said, how can this be since I promised him my body count will always be 0?
Well,
Okay.
I wouldn't say that's a great localization, but
It kind of
It's hysterical.
is like
it's hard for me to think that way.
it's still the same. It's still the same meaning.
It is.
It's
It is.
just in language that we identify as being so slang that it seems almost blasphemous in comparison to the language we grew up with.
Oh
But when you consider that these are how these kids are talking to each other now,
and that's how. Yeah.
it is so different than even the slang and the words that we used in high school, right? Which were much. It's not this removed from like some more proper sort of English or whatever.
Yeah.
But it's just crazy, right? So I could see what I'm saying is I could see English getting to a point not that relatively far into the future where a kid would pick up Shakespeare and be like, I have no freaking idea. I can read the words. I can sound those words out, but I have no clue what that says, right? So anyway, Japanese is already at that point for like the samurai Japanese, right? So anyway, I thought we'd jump into this, give some examples of some of the gripes that this guy had with the translation and get some of your thoughts on it. I've been interested in seeing what you think about this since I saw it. So I'm not going to give the name of the Twitter account. I don't want anyone going over there and like, you know, like dumping on this guy or making fun of him or something. I simply want to read what he's saying and just kind of respond to the points, right? Both the good points, because I think there are some good points, and the ones that we might disagree with.
Okay.
So, Unicorn Overlord had a free demo released. After playing it, I can say quite confidently that the localization is abhorrent. I mean, it's a very strong
that is
word.
A very strong word.
Now, so I put a pinned comment on the video I released this week and said, hey, I'm aware of this, and I'll talk about it later.
It is later.
We had some people underneath that responding who had seen this and said this account is somebody who tends to be, let's just call it very harsh.
Yeah, skeptical on
literally any Japanese translation for like anime and that kind of media at all. So like that's just this guy's thing, right? I don't know that. I'm just saying that's what that person told me. So maybe take some of this with a grain of salt, or at least with that, knowing that bias ahead of time without being too hard on the guy. But okay, so he says it's abhorrent. Here begins a thread of numerous examples. So number one, a quick note to start with, they actually revised the difficulty screen. I don't care about this one. So rather than saying easy, they put story. So apparently, or the word casual is not used. So he's like, you know, maybe, or he's saying like, apparently using the word casual in English is like a dirty word. I don't know about that, but whatever. Here's where we actually get into the text. So one of the most persistent issues with the localization is the endless attempts of the English script to fancify dialogue, typically at the expense of accuracy. So let's look at this and see if you think the accuracy is off.
Okay.
So first example, this is what his translation of
which
the Japanese,
once again is not. It's a translation, and he thinks, okay, fine,
but maybe more technically, literally accurate, right?
Maybe.
So in English, I think fighting Renault with our current strength would be difficult. There's the Japanese there. I don't know if you can read that or if that seems about right to you. But then he says in English, casting the gauntlet at Renault's feet would only send us all to an early grave. I do not see that as being, it's exactly the same thing. That means the same thing. And it's not fancified or like padded to a degree where it's like running long or something like that. That's just how they're trying to make the dialogue fit a medieval time period.
Yes, which is sweet. That's part of translation. It's not just like, hey, what do the 2024 people say nowadays, and let's give it to them straight. It's also, this game to Americans and to Europeans and most English speakers, this game feels like an old medieval version of the culture, back when people who spoke English spoke more like that.
Yes.
And so to localize it isn't just to give it to us in a way that we can understand perfectly to our 2024, like sensibilities, but is also to give us the feeling that we're playing something that has like some age, that has some weight behind it, that's old and that's been, from people who are not of our current time period, but from an age gone by.
Yeah.
That's what this dialogue does, and that's what his dialogue does not do.
Yes. So I also want to say, just as a point of fairness, that it's perfectly valid to want or appreciate the more straightforward modern English.
It is valid.
To want that instead. I would rather that they speak more clearly like this. Right. I shouldn't say clearly, I should just say in more modern terms.
I'll tell you what, have you ever... Here, this might be actually an interesting point. Have you ever seen an anime where the translators opted for a King James like English or a Shakespearean translation?
I don't think so.
I have not either. That doesn't mean it shouldn't exist.
Yes, good point.
It would be difficult to read, though. Often subtitles are going by pretty quickly, and you're having to read, and you're not wanting to miss the action, but still catch all the words.
Yeah.
Translating anime, which I'm assuming this person would be good at,
yeah,
or have a lot of experience with, is different because you are just trying to convey the info very quickly so that the people can still watch what's happening in terms of the action.
Right.
They don't have to think about it too much. Translating a game or something like this is a whole different game. You have more freedom in a game than you would in an anime.
Right.
So what he is saying here is like, it would have been easier to be more straightforward. That's fine. And if you're translating anime, that's probably the right choice.
Yeah.
Being all flowery and superfluous with your language when somebody's talking quickly or when people are trying to watch a movie and they only need to just understand.
And they got to sync the lips.
And things can't go on too long. That perfectly understandable for anime.
Yeah.
And to try to apply those rules to a video game is probably 90% of the time like a decent idea. Like it's pretty close, pretty similar, but they're not exactly the same. And this is one way that they aren't exactly the same. Yeah. You can take your time and read it. You can try to immerse yourself maybe more in
I should
what
also
they're
note,
trying to.
That all these lines are voice acted, but they're not necessarily animated and synced with the lips or something.
That's
like
fine,
that.
but they're voice acted in English, right?
Yes,
hardcore.
Yes.
That's awesome.
Yes.
And then now I'm a really big fan of the Shakespeare-ness, right? Like the Shakespearean, the King James English,
Yeah.
Like when it's voice acted by a theatrically trained actor.
Yeah.
Like you can't get better than that in terms of the English language, Okay, now I'm being a little bit facetious here.
Sure.
But the fact that it's voice acted in English is, once again, you don't have to worry too much about reading the text quickly because you're hearing it, right? Now, if you want to read it in English and then play it in Japanese, it's gonna be a little hard. It might be a little bit more difficult, but don't do that. First of all, the game makers don't expect you to do that. They didn't design the game with that type of playing in mind.
Yeah.
But at the same time, even if you did, you can push A whenever you're done reading. It's fine. It's totally fine.
Yeah.
I really like the King James. I just got to say that.
I like it too, but and this is my thing. Like it's one thing to be like, I would rather they translate it this way than that way. Perfectly valid opinion.
Oh, totally valid.
And to be like, hey, I'm disappointed that they did it this way. If that's your gripe or your claim, there's no argument against that. That's perfectly valid. The part that I struggle with here is that he's saying that they're doing this to the detriment or at the expense of accuracy.
And that does not appear to be the case.
And that is not correct in this instance.
Yeah.
Okay, so I think fighting Renault with our current strength would be difficult, and casting the gauntlet at Renault's feet would only send us to an early grave is the same thing.
Now, it does convey a difference in character. That's true. Like the character, just someone who speaks in more King James English sounds... Maybe they sound more intelligent. They sound more well-read. They sound more poetic. It does affect the character when it's written in that way. But when everyone's dialogue is written in that way, and no one person is like specifically singled out, like, oh, he speaks in some flowery King James way, nobody else is talking that way.
Yeah.
But when everyone's speaking that way, it just throws you backwards in time a little bit. Now, the fact that he's using maybe some... I don't know what you would call it. Maybe an analogy of casting a gauntlet, right?
Yes, right.
What that means or what that meant a long time ago. And then the other guy isn't saying that, right? A person who makes a metaphor is a certain kind of person, whereas a person who's straightforward is maybe a different type of person, right? There is some personality, like differences here.
Yeah.
But First off, I don't care at all because this is sweet. Second off, if everyone's talking that way, then it's less of this guy's special because he talks in metaphor, and it's more like this is just how everyone talks.
Yes.
Right? In which case it takes what would seem like a massive personality difference and it kind of levels it back out and says, no, he's just in with the times of the people he's with.
Yeah. Well, 2 points I want to make on that. First of all, a lot of the times the characters talking are nobles and knights who are the kinds of people who would be have elevated language, etiquette, a more sort of like advanced way of speaking. They would be more educated and more well-read and whatnot. And there are examples of people in this game who are more base-born or lower, who are a little bit less that way.
Does that show in the translation?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
They speak more
but they're
simply.
still doing it in a way that would have been represented in an older work of English.
Good.
So they're not going to sound like a current person from the slums or something like that.
Yeah.
They're going to sound like a person from 1700 from the slums or something like that. So anyway, I wanted to really point out, first of all, that if you believe that changing this to this is losing accuracy, then I think you probably have not, and I don't want to assume too much. I hate doing that. So maybe I should say I would question this person if he were here in the room. I would ask them, how much have you read of works from like before 1900? Have you read the King James Bible? It's okay if you haven't. I'm not making fun of you.
That's what you're trying to say.
I'm saying that if you're not familiar with that, this is why I said in a podcast that's actually going to come out after this, because we're recording this after, but we're going to release it sooner.
Yeah, that's right.
That I'm so glad my mother raised us reading not only the King James Bible, but also Shakespeare. And a lot of
Charles Dickens.
older literature.
Yeah, that's fun.
Like classical literature.
Yeah.
That was like a big thing in my house. And it wasn't only that she would read it to us, she would assign us to read those books.
Yeah.
So as a young kid, I was reading books like that. And so I became familiar with not only with language like this, but with how they used it. And so it's to the point to where when I see it done incorrectly, using thee in the wrong place or thou in the wrong place, it like, oh, that's not right. That doesn't sound right at all. This person's not familiar with how this should actually be written. So because I'm familiar with that kind of language, I read something like that. And not only do I appreciate it, but I understand it means exactly the same thing. It's not inaccurate. So anyway, as far as that example goes, that's not inaccurate. Here's the next one. So there's the Japanese. It says, Joseph, I will leave the rest to you. Over here, my faith and more lies with you, Joseph. I only pray it's enough. That basically means the same thing. It's not inaccurate.
Geez. This is funny because, like I can see what he's saying.
I know,
I totally
but it's not.
But it's not. You're right.
Inaccurate.
You're right. But in one case, and I don't know, in one case, it's, hey, I'm just going to leave this to you. In another case, he's saying, he says faith and pray, right? First of all, which hints that maybe he's a religious type person, right?
And who utilizes faith and prayer. Yeah, everyone was. Medieval times. Yes, everybody belonged to the Catholic Church or Church of England or whatever.
Yes.
Everybody was religious.
And everybody went to church at least once a week. Often people went to church once a day.
Yes.
And the important thing to know about that is the fact that they were hearing. So even a peasant who didn't have this big flowery vocabulary, every day they would listen to a sermon or hear from the Bible that did speak that way. So they still understood it.
Yes.
Right? They still... I would still assume that they mostly would have spoken like that in their day-to-day, but they would have had their own little, localized ways of talking that would be different from the Bible.
Yeah.
But for the most part, everyone heard that every single day, right? And so that's fine. But I would see maybe somebody taking offense at that and being like, what? This is all religious language, but the Japanese
isn't. Freaking knight has a cross on his shield.
Sorry.
There's a cross on the fetching shield right there. Of course they're religious.
So the localization was perfect.
Yes.
The localization was perfect. I'm trying to, you know, maybe voice his concern a little that some people might think like, oh, you made him into a Jesus dude. But it's like, there's a freaking cross on his shield.
So like the next
and I don't
one,
know, maybe he is in the story. I don't really know. I haven't played the game much.
So
or at all.
The second example here, it's just the word farewell. And in the English translation, they added a line, farewell and may the heavens guide you. Now, I've heard some people complaining they're adding things like whole phrases that weren't in the Japanese. But again, that's just about rooting it in a culture that as far as our history as like Western European culture goes, which is what all this design is based on, they were all freaking Catholics and they all freaking talked that way.
Yes.
It's not like some sort of arrogant, like, I think I'm better than you. And that's another thing I really want to point out. As someone who works in a marketing department at, I would say like a mid-sized company, not even for like a huge corporation, which a lot of these companies, they're all either contracted by or work in giant corporations. We just did a podcast a couple weeks ago all about the corporatization of the industry and how that has changed the culture of gaming and everything like that. You don't just as some like translator person go, I think it would sound better if I wrote it like that. And not have that then go up the chain like 5 or 6 levels of approvals.
Right. First off, the peer approval process. Then you have your own supervisor. Then he's got like a manager, and then the executives have to sign off on it. I mean, like, come on.
Nobody is just going to throw something in there that they think is better. Right. They would do it because they were directed to do it or because they were corrected to do it.
Yep. It's top down.
This has gone through many, many, many different people higher up the chain who would read that and say approved because that's what they were told to do. First of all, how do you know?
Yeah, this isn't 1997 anymore.
Yes. I think that's this perception that like there's no communication between the Japanese team and English team comes from that time period.
When it did happen.
Yes.
Several very famous examples. And now everyone kind of assumes that that's still what's happening, but it's not. The translation industry is quite different from what it was in the 90s when it was Ted Woolsey himself and they signed off on it and they did whatever he wrote, they just printed, right?
Yeah.
But nowadays, it's different. It goes up and down the whole chain. There's a whole process now. There's whole companies that specialize in this, that get hired out to do this, of people who are, dare I say, very capable speakers of the language that you're critiquing.
Yes.
And these people have, determined that it passes the test for what the game designers actually wanted or told them to do.
Yes.
Right. So you're right. There's tons of levels of checks here. It's not the 90s anymore.
Yeah. And, Richard Honeywood, who translated Xenogears, is famous in as far as localization, the sort of history of localization in gaming goes, for being the guy who started that and said, this is not acceptable what you're doing.
Yeah.
Like, this is not okay to just you throw something over to me in this jumbled mess that I have to sort of put together and that I have 2 or 3 months to like translate this whole massive tome of text like by myself. And then you guys just trust me that it's good.
Nope.
That doesn't work. Like this cannot continue.
This cannot continue.
And so he put a team in place. He set up a system within Square to start changing how they did localization. And you'll notice right after that, their localization started getting good.
Specifically around Matsuno's heyday when he was doing
Vagrant Story,
and
Final Fantasy 12 after that. So anyway, I just wanted to point that out too.
Yeah. I also want to say something else about this farewell line.
Yeah.
It's so funny because do you know what the word goodbye means? Do you know where it comes from?
You told me about this the other week, but explain it.
God be with you.
Yeah.
That's what goodbye means.
Yeah.
God turned into good, and then God by ye became goodbye. And now we pretend that it has no reference to any type of, supernatural fanciness in the world. And when we say it, generally speaking, we don't. It's just like you're leaving and I'm being polite and I'm stating that you're leaving while being polite, and that's what goodbye means, right?
Yeah.
But take it back a few centuries and goodbye was a prayer. right? It was like Godspeed. It was like, and it's still in the Latin languages, right? Adios.
Yep.
Adios. What does
Yep.
that mean?
Yep.
To God.
To God. Exactly.
To God, right? May God speedily, be there for you if you need it.
Yeah.
And this is back when traveling was kind of dangerous. I'm assuming in Unicorn Overlord, travel is dangerous. I'm assuming you're going to have encounters and fights, and there's going to be a lot of that.
Right.
Then something like "May the heavens guide you" doesn't sound so weird.
No.
Only because in 2024 we think that going down the sidewalk and it's not dangerous, and we don't need to give anybody a prayer or a blessing for anything if they're just leaving. I'll see you tomorrow. I'll text you or whatever. It's no big deal. In the world of this game, it's not like that. It's a dangerous world, right? And you would wish a blessing upon somebody who was leaving.
Right. Excellent point. All right, let's go to the next one here. We completely fell for it is the more transliterated Japanese. And then guy laid out the bait and we just had to take a nibble. Again, it's not inaccurate. It's communicating the exact same idea. It's just using language that, as we've been saying, fits the time period they're trying to emulate.
It's really no different. The meaning is the same.
This one, what is it? Now I'm curious. Are you sure? Anxiety will be the death of you if you keep it bottled up like that. So that's different. That's the first one where I look at that and I'm like, that is not the same. Like that's an added sort of meaning that isn't just in the. Now I'm curious, right? Anxiety will be the death of you if you keep it bottled up like that.
It should be the death of me.
Yeah, death of me.
Yeah, but that's Japanese has a failing, which is they often omit the subject, and it's difficult for translators sometimes to figure it out. That could be an error.
That's the first example I've seen yet where it's like, you might have a point with that, but again, I read that in English, and I don't see anything wrong with that, or it being some sort of like dramatically different thing that makes me think about the character's personality in some like radically different way. Well, it's not the same, sure. Yeah. But I wouldn't take offense to this yet. Later down here, it does feel that way, and I can't say I feel any different.
It feels that way.
It's the same.
It's like you say something, and I could either say it feels that way, or I could say it doesn't feel different than that. Yeah. If the thing he's pointing out here is just a mistake, that's fine. There's a mistake, right? Sure. But that's not. I don't think that doesn't make a translation abhorrent that there's a mistake or two. And you can point out all the mistakes you want. I'm not saying there are no mistakes. I'm saying that the reference that the translation is abhorrent because it keeps changing things too much that's more the thing we're critiquing.
Yes. So. That I mean, I'm willing to admit, like, at least as I'm going to trust that what you're saying is
that he has the additional
exactly
context
what that should mean.
We're missing
that this is different, but I would by no means take this to the point of saying it's abhorrent, because it's not. It's such a little thing that does not change any context of anything like very important or essential. Yeah. To the story that you're missing somehow because of that, right?
Click it one more time. I thought these were all separate dialogues. Do these all come in sequence one after each other?
I don't know, but they're in the same scene, I would assume.
Okay, but depending on if they're in sequence one after the other, then it seems like he translated it correctly.
Okay.
But if they come at
different
times, then there could be something else going on.
I would assume they're probably in sequence. But. Okay, let's move down to the next one here. So in this one, he says, this reeks of localizers who think themselves better writers than the original Japanese authors. We already sort of addressed this, so I'm not going to belabor that point, but this is the source.
They're two different language. How would you say that I'm a better writer than you because you localize it differently?
This point makes no sense to me
this point,
at all.
We'll see it, though.
Not only because that's just not the way it works in a corporation, but like... Yeah, like these languages are so... Anyways, what you just said. This is the source of many of the localization's problems. So up here we got, are you worrying about Scarlet translated to...
All that worrying
worrying's going to kill you one of these days. Let me guess it's about Scarlet. Literally, how is that different?
It's the same thing. Now, okay, so he's saying that because they added so many words that they think they're better than the Japanese writer because... Yes. They added so many words, and those words weren't there. And why would you do that unless you thought you were better?
Yes.
Right? He completely not thinking about whether or not the director of the game wanted that to happen.
Yes.
But
not having any knowledge of that. To make such a strong claim that these localizers thought they were better writers than the Japanese writers.
When they were
you have literally no concept of what this process was.
Yeah.
You weren't there. You haven't talked to any of these people. You literally have no idea what you're talking about, and you're going to make that claim about them.
I have another thing too. There could be a reason why even the more 1800s samurai Japanese, which most Japanese people can't understand, they do put it in a lot of the movies, the samurai movies and stuff. It's different. It's quite different. But it feels older. There's a reason, I think, why they don't put that Japanese into these kinds of games, and it's because this medieval stuff it's not part of their culture. This isn't part of the Japanese language. The Japanese didn't evolve this way. If they started using samurai Japanese to refer to a knight, it doesn't feel the same. It's like they would be inputting, people in Japanese would be inputting their own ideas of the samurai into the game
like
that they're playing.
English knight
but it's
or
English.
French
It's
knight
not
or
that.
something.
Yeah. But they don't have a better way of doing it than just to put it more modernly, right? And then, in the localization, we'll make sure it feels like it fits that time period. But in Japanese, there's no way of actually doing that.
With the language itself.
Right, because, and I would say, just use the samurai Japanese, but that conveys a different meaning than what they're trying to convey, especially with their blessings about heaven and God, and like the way that you would say these things in Japanese, like it's a different idea, right?
That's totally true, because it was not a Christian religion that they
so in Japanese
from.
Exactly. So in Japanese, they're trying to convey this idea of a Christian medieval society, whereas in the Japanese, if they said their word for God, it's a different God, right? It's like that doesn't even make sense, right? Their idea of heaven is a totally different version than the Christian heaven, so it makes way more sense for them to kind of use a lot of katakana and just kind of get around it in modern Japanese.
So I wonder,
just localize it properly for the people who are part of that heritage, where the words do make sense to them and it is still English.
How would the Portuguese, for instance, who were I think the first Western culture to discover Japan,
yes, that's right.
How did they go about talking about Christian concepts with those
hard.
people?
It was not
what
easy.
words did they use for that?
That's a good question. I think they would have used, like kami-sama, they would have used the generalized words of Japan to try to explain it. But I do know that Christianity did not gain a good foothold in Japan. No, and that could be part of it. And I know that in modern times, specifically recently, like my brother was a missionary there for a while, and they katakana everything now, because they're like, it doesn't work. It doesn't fit. When we try to use their word for something, we're not saying the same thing.
So they're just using the English word, but
now
writing it with katakana.
With katakana, because that way, when a Japanese person hears it, they think, "Oh, that's not my culture.
Foreign word.
It's something else," and they know that when they hear it. Whereas the previous translations in Japanese of things like the Bible and missionary work and all of the church stuff, they tried to make it fit in, and I just think it just didn't work well.
Yeah,
it just doesn't fit in well. It's too different.
Okay, this next line: "I can't hide anything from you, huh? I couldn't pretend otherwise. You'd sniff out the lie before it scarce passed my lips." Again,
whatever. He just doesn't like that they're being poetic, but I like poetry.
Yeah,
I like poetry. Do you like poetry?
I sure do.
What's wrong with poetry? And once again, Japanese poetry is different than English poetry. So the fact they didn't opt for the poetic use in Japan doesn't mean it's not what they always intended for the English to be.
Yeah. So I think we can kind of skip past that one, or we're going to kind of be making the same points, but it's a lot of that kind of thing. This one, he goes, in particular, the localization loves allusions to animals for some reason. Now,
allusions to animals are sweet.
Here's a really good example. So the Japanese for I think this is Renault here, and Scarlet. So he's he's captured Scarlet. And he says to her, "Decided to quiet down at last, And she says, "They will definitely come to save me." Now in the English, "So the foal has finally ceased braying, And my hopes are as true as the morning sun, they'll come." Again, I saw somebody, not this guy, but somebody responding to this stuff saying, what's true about the morning sun, and why is she being compared to a horse?
The morning sun. Okay, that person must be purposefully
either
being dense. What's true about the morning sun is that it's the most reliable thing in the world. It comes every morning.
Obviously.
Yes.
This is like Anyway, this is what I'm talking about when I'm saying that the current generation and beyond is probably losing an understanding that we had, and probably that we had to a greater degree than a lot of our own classmates and contemporaries.
Yeah.
Because we were forced to read this stuff.
Reading this stuff.
So because
and
of
gaining
that,
an appreciation for it.
yeah, because of that, I read that and I know that says the same thing.
Yes.
That is not inaccurate.
Not at all. Yeah.
It is exactly what that means. They're using allegory and metaphor, and that's how they talked in that time, back and forth to each other.
Light and truth were the same thing.
Yes.
Right? The light is what reveals the truth of things to your eyes, right? Here's another thing. Can you imagine thinking that translation on the left is better
than that one?
Than the one on the right.
Imagine
In
that.
what world is it possible that translation on the left is better? Now, I get it. He's talking about being perfectly accurate and transliterating every, syllable. Fine, whatever. But I'd much prefer to have the flowery beauty of the poetic language on the right way more than the straightforward boringness of the left, which may be more accurate.
So to answer the question, or to the point, the localization loves allusions to animals for some reason. It isn't for some reason. They used allusions to the things around them. A lot of these people were farmers. Almost all of them were farmers.
Good point.
Who raised animals, and they would use the things they were familiar with to make metaphors and make points or parables about what they were trying to say, because they read the Bible the freaking time. That's what Jesus did.
Exactly.
That's what they were born and bred to communicate like. That's why. That's why medieval English sounded like that, because it was deeply rooted in religion. And in the religion it was rooted in, their religious figure spoke in parables literally all the time. That's why.
There you go. There you go. And that explains everything. That explains everything perfectly.
Yes.
I don't know, man.
I don't. Should we make more points?
That was a strong point.
Let's see. In Japanese, okay, this one might be getting into more of like character changes.
Okay, I'd be interested to see this.
And this is where I think there are some better, more like valid points. In Japanese, Elaine is assuming Joseph is assuring Joseph that his mother needs protection more than he does in English.
So he's still doing it, just not as much.
Yeah, they've changed Elaine to acting accusatory towards Joseph. Instead of just saying like, hey, my mom needs help, more like accusing, hey, why aren't you helping her? So let's read that.
Depending on how the story goes, that may be appropriate.
So in the Japanese here, Joseph, I'll be fine. You should lend your strength to my mother, right? So I'm okay. Go help her.
Yeah.
In this version, why are you just standing there, Joseph? Aren't you going to help her?
Yeah,
now,
that's different.
That's
different.
I think is a legitimate point.
Yeah.
I think that, again, I don't think it's abhorrent. I don't think it's so bad that it changes Elaine's entire character or something.
Yeah.
But it is definitely, I think, too strong, or maybe stepping a bit over that line to make him accusatory here.
Yeah.
When here he's just saying, he's basically just wanting Joseph to go help his mom and not worry about him. Now, this is where I don't know anything about the Japanese language and culture, so I don't know if maybe how he's stating that, and maybe this particular words, maybe it's less formal or something, and so maybe it would get across the point that because he's being less formal, he's being more urgent. See, I don't know that, so I can't challenge that point because I'm not ingrained enough in the culture. But I could see a scenario in which the translators looked at that and said, he's not using formal language here. Again, this is totally speculation. I can't read what that says.
That is not formal language.
So maybe they're reading that and being like, he's not speaking formally. Maybe that could be read or could be understood that he's being more urgent, like, hey, go help her. And so in order to get that urgency across, which they thought was important in that line, they said, how can we do that in English? Maybe make him say it this way, like, why are you just standing there? Like, go help her. You could voice that in a way that doesn't sound necessarily accusatory as much as just please, like pleading, like, hey, how can you just stand there? Please go help her, right? So they may have had a reason, is all I'm saying. I think it would be premature to just look at those two things and be like, oh, they thought they knew better or something like that. But I do see this as being a point where if that's what he said, and
it is,
and
yeah.
if it's softer like
That's
that,
accurate.
if it's softer like that, I would have done it differently in the English. I wouldn't have made it accusatory. So I'm with you on that one.
That one is the best one. And reading the Japanese, I mean, I've been tracking along with this. He is translating everything correctly.
Yeah.
To his own version. It just is a stretch to then say that his is better, or to then say that they did it wrong.
Yes.
For the translators,
Right.
both of those two things, that's a stretch. But he's translating it just fine.
Yeah.
As far as I can tell.
So I wanted to at least include some of these examples where I agree, because I don't want to just make it sound like, I'm dumping on this guy or something.
Yeah.
So Elena's dialogue is rewritten to insult Valmore, whereas in Japanese she's shocked that things have come to this. I agree with this one too. So it changes how you see the dynamic between her previous knight who's betrayed her.
Okay.
In one, she's maybe learning this for the first time, but that can't be right because she knew they were coming. But anyway, General Valmore, I never thought you would lead a rebellion. Changed to our great general, reduced to little more than a base traitor.
That one's okay. I don't think that one's so bad.
I think it's
but the next one might be.
It's just not the same. I'm agreeing that it's not the same meaning there.
Gotcha.
This one, however, I refuse to let you do as you like. I will strike you down here. Changed to, you'll find my head not so easily parted from my shoulders. Valmore, so hard to read.
I
wonder if you can say the same. So that's really different too.
It is.
So again, I kind of agree with this one, but not that it's horrible. It's not so far removed that it's like impossible to follow the story, or that it's in some really dramatic, radical way changing the character. But I do agree that in one, she seems more like maybe she's appealing to a side of him she thought she knew before. And here she's more just like trying to put him down a little bit, maybe, or insult or mock him. So I can see that. I can see why you would rather or feel like, they could have done something differently there that would have been more accurate. This one, he's talking about it being purple. I just don't think we agree with what he considers purple. What's this one? At the start of the game, Scarlet is suddenly attacked by Xenorban soldiers. She smacks one, and he jumps back. Then Elaine appears to get the other. This wasn't there's some kanji there I don't know, moment in Japanese. I think what they're alluding to here is, she's fast as he jumps back, whereas more like damn it, or some kind of cursing word.
Yeah,
and then not so fast as I, and in the Japanese it was more just kind of a battle cry or something. Again, that's just not really important in my opinion. This one I agree with a little more. So she says that was scary in Japanese. She's on the ground. She says that was scary. And then in English it was translated to only a little shaken, that's all. So that can make it feel like it wasn't that big a deal. Like I'm fine. Whereas in this one, she was expressing more like, "Whoo, that was like that got to me," right?
Right.
So again, that some people I think are considering that like a character change, and while I feel it's minimal at best, it is still a character change.
It is a character change. But you're just being really picky if that's the kind of things that you're presenting to everybody, I guess.
Yeah,
but
to be so upset about that you call it abhorrent, I think. That's just a disagreement. I just think you're going way beyond the pale to go that far over something that I think is, again, like, tell me how this changes how we perceive Scarlet in such a way that it would make us maybe misread or misunderstand what we're supposed to know about her for some later important reveal about that character or something. You know what I'm saying? Like, it's not going to make so much of a contextual difference of character that I'm going to somehow just completely get the wrong idea about the type of person she is.
Right.
And that's why, again, I just think this is sort of like, well, I hate using the word nitpick because one man's nitpick is, another man's like giant issue.
Yeah.
But so I don't want to call it that as much as again, if this person was in the room, I would ask them to explain to me why they think that character change would make some difference as far as how we understand the character that would make us misunderstand an important thing later, which he can't know because he hasn't played the whole game. So maybe that's to be determined at this point. But
well, so kawakata means that was scary. But at the same time, I almost wonder in Japan, I don't know, maybe they're trying to make Scarlet seem like a stronger character towards Western audiences that is less afraid, I guess. Whereas in the Japanese, it was like she said that was scary. But in the English, they're like, they have a different audience that they're trying to appeal to, and is maybe less acceptable to have in America to have a woman.
Yeah,
be scared.
There's certainly a part of our popular culture that wants women to be portrayed as being stronger.
Yeah, all the time.
So, like, I think
I almost wonder if that's. But this is soft, though. If that's what they're doing,
I
it's
don't
soft.
think that this is like overtly that.
Okay.
But what I am saying is, I could see again not the localizer who might have translated that, and then they said, corporate level, our women in this game maybe aren't portrayed strong enough. We would like that came down the chain to them,
probably,
and they were like, okay, fine. I mean, like I would assume that way before I would assume like just Joe Schmo localizer guy was like, I know how to do this better. Like I could way more see this going. They've completed their scene. And they send the scene on to their supervisor. Supervisor says, "Okay, it checks out." Send it up to their supervisor, and this supervisor is in charge specifically of like inclusion or something like that, right? They have a person for that on like a committee, and so like they look at this and go, I think we could maybe make the female characters feel a little stronger and less weak or something like that. Maybe can you alter
that?
And they send that feedback back down, and he goes, ugh, just like all of us do who are in that position. Oh my gosh, it's so stupid. It's not accurate to the character. You might be losing something important.
Exactly.
And they say, whatever, I'll do it anyways. And they try to do the best thing they can to keep both camps happy. Yeah. And that's what they came up with. That scenario, I'm telling you, is a million times more likely than what this guy is saying.
You just explained what happens to me like every week.
Yes, it happens to me every week at work. That's why I'm saying it. Yeah. Like, have you worked in a company before? This is how it works.
That's hysterical.
The artists aren't making the last choice. They're the last approval. They don't get the final check mark on this thing. It goes to some freaking guy in an office wearing a suit who doesn't freaking know anything we think and who we complain about behind his back. Like, that's what's happening there, right?
Yeah.
So I could see that being a thing. Now, I think we've talked enough about that.
Yeah.
I'd like to get to the Yasumi Matsuno stuff here.
Good.
So he responded, "This is my personal opinion." He wrote all this in English, by the way. I wonder how he's doing this, if he just knows English or if he's...
he probably does know some English, but when he says, "This is my personal opinion, but may I share it with you?"
That sounds very Japanese.
That sounds like somebody who put the Japanese into Google Translate.
Sure.
That sounds like it was poorly localized, is what it sounds like.
Okay.
This sounds like a transliteration of the Japanese.
Yeah. I believe that it's unacceptable for someone to alter a work without considering the original author's intent.
Boom.
However,
the author's intent.
When the market or language is different, a direct translation may not convey the intended meaning accurately.
Right.
Which is what I was talking about earlier.
As anyone who translates should know.
Yes. This is especially true for humor. Therefore, or for musical lyrics, especially.
Oh, yeah.
Therefore, I think some degree of alteration is unavoidable.
Of course.
The issue lies in whether the original author has consented to these alterations. Has anyone confirmed whether the author of Unicorn Overlord has approved of its English translation? In any case, I think both arguments have merit, translating faithfully to the original and allowing some degree of adaptation. I encourage discussion on this matter, as I do not intend to take sides. However, if the original author approves, I believe that should be respected. That's all.
Of course. Because the whole point...
That was beautifully put.
The whole point is authorial intent. Like, this isn't what was intended. How do you know what was intended?
Yes.
Let's get the
How
author's
do you know
opinion.
that?
If the author said it was good, now maybe he doesn't speak so good English. I don't know. That's entirely
Yes.
possible. And it's like, well, I can't approve this, but it's if everyone tells me it's right, so it's right, I guess. That's a different situation. But I don't know. I don't know the specifics in that case.
Yeah.
But if the author approves it, then who are you to say that it was done poorly?
And there's some people who responded to him here who I assume with the way they're talking don't know
They
who they're
don't
talking
realize
to.
who they're talking to. This man's a legend, people.
So like this guy says, I think the motivation for the author agreeing to the changes is the problem. Many localizers don't have the best interests of Japanese creators at heart. They falsely claim that changes are necessary to appeal to a wider audience
That does
when
happen.
they just want to censor things they hate.
Okay, like that does happen.
It
Let's
does
be real.
happen,
That does
but
happen.
I don't think it happens nearly as often as people think it does.
Sure. Yeah.
I think
That's
they
probably true.
are overzealous in this sort of like vendetta they have. It's
That
not
it's always,
without merit.
yeah.
Again, we did another podcast episode. I don't know when it's going up in relation to this, but that was all about trying to understand, like to go to the enemy camp, so to speak, or the group of that you think is like in opposition to you, and try to find the thing in their ideology that fills a hole in your own,
Right, that
and
whole
helps
thing.
you understand them
Yeah,
better.
the
So
Hegelian,
you might
yeah.
have to wait till next week to see that.
Yeah, I might
but this
see that.
applies to what I'm talking about. So I see what he's saying. I see the merit in it because
Yes.
there are examples of
That
legitimate
happens.
censorship that are BS.
Yeah. Well,
right?
that's actually happening in anime a lot now.
Yeah.
Things are being Americanized a lot as they're being brought over now that was not in the original Japanese.
Yeah.
And that is a thing that happens and is happening.
Yes. So I think we acknowledged that earlier,
Yeah.
and I want to acknowledge it again. This does happen. However, I do think there is a certain camp of people who are so upset about it that they're kind of looking for it in everything and finding it where it doesn't actually exist. I think this would be an example where they're not trying to censor it at all. I don't see any of those lines as being an example of like
I
the
don't think so.
wider American audience won't accept this.
Yeah, that was
We
none
have
of
to-
those was
None
censorship.
of that was censorship
Yeah,
at
I
all.
didn't see that at all.
So you have a point, guy who
Yeah.
wrote this. Your point does not apply to
not
this
this.
game or this example, right?
Yeah.
So Yasumi Matsuno replies to this. So the translators are making such statements. Is there any interview articles? Please let me know. I'd like to read them.
He just
So-
said, sources? Source, please?
Trust me, bro. So he's actually responding to a lot of people in this kind of
Yeah.
way. This person
one's
says,
interesting.
most times original creators don't even know the target language
Yeah,
of the
that's what- yeah.
translation, and they agree, believing that people responsible for the translation job are doing the right thing, which is the opposite in most cases.
This
Now,
is true.
That's a big assumption too, though.
Right.
Like, they may not know the language,
Hmm.
but certainly today they have a relationship to some degree
Oh, sure.
with who they choose, because a lot of times they're contracting a company they don't maybe have an internal division, or if they do, they're busy on something else,
Yeah.
and they're contracting another team to come in and do the localization.
Mm-hmm.
They would have vetted that team before they hired them. They
think
would have
so.
had somebody from their team who is bilingual and can
of course.
communicate back and forth. Like this is not the days of the 90s where they're just like, I trust you, dude, just like do it. We don't really care. We just want American audiences' money. Like that's not happening now.
Yeah.
So this guy is making an assumption that I think can be true or has been true at some point, but to assume that it's like widespread now, I think is far-fetched. So, but I think his response, Matsuno's response, is great. I'm aware that this is the case, and it is very unfortunate, especially for languages other than English. This is a very good point, such as French or German. We have no choice but to trust the evaluations of the translators and local sales companies. In that sense, I think, I think it is entirely reasonable for everyone to demand translations that adhere to the original work. Translations that deviate from the original work in a negative sense are out of the question. On the other hand, as long as there is no deviation, I also believe that some degree of adaptation is unavoidable.
It's a fact.
Translating the nuances of Japanese into English is already quite challenging, and it's not as simple as doing a literal translation. there are also budget and schedule constraints to consider. While I think having a perfect translation would be best, I also understand that it's not always feasible. This is always a difficult issue for sales companies and development teams. This is just my personal opinion. I hope that you find it helpful. Excessive politeness.
Yes, very much
But
so.
the point being that jumping to conclusions
Yeah.
about how this team decided to make this and that change is, well, it's wrong. It's wrong to do it because you're not correct about why they made those changes. And so what you should do is go speak to someone, reach out to somebody on that translation team,
Right,
and
as
say,
you
hey,
have found.
could I interview you?
Right.
I'd love to learn more about your process and about why maybe you did this and that. And maybe there's contractual reasons why they can't say the real reason why that happens.
Sure,
And then
yeah,
maybe
that
20 years
happens.
later, they'll tell you the truth. That has also happened.
Yes.
But the point being, like, just don't jump to conclusions that these people are trying to like purposefully change this work because they think it's better or they're arrogant or they're trying to censor it. That does happen, but that can't be your first assumption. And I think this is a great example where when you make that assumption, you jump all over something that to me is clearly not what you're so against. Go be against when it's really happening.
Right.
It's not happening here. I don't think. That's my feeling about all this. And I think Yasumi Matsuno hits it right on the head.
Yeah.
Go talk to the freaking guy and get an actual quote from him.
Yeah.
Go talk to the creator, the author in Japanese.
Which
ask
is,
him, did he direct them to do this? If not, go talk to them and say, did your boss tell you to do this? Right? Like, talk to somebody there first before you start, devaluing their effort and making assumptions and accusations like this. So,
great.
Anyway,
I think that's wonderful.
I think the English is really great.
What's really great.
I really like
yes,
it.
more games should do this.
I mean, I'm going through this game. I'm playing it. I do my 8 hours with the demo.
Yeah.
I get to the end of that. The plot of Unicorn Overlord is not. It's not like Xenogears or something like super deep, but it's serviceable as like a plot where a prince. It's kind of like it's actually very similar to the first Fire Emblem, which is Marth.
Okay.
Marth, his kingdom gets taken over. He goes and lives on an island for a while. He grows up with a cavalry knight who sort of like teaches him, and then they gather an army and they go back and take the kingdom back. It's basically that story, sort of repackaged and obviously greatly extended, and there's way more dialogue and words, but it's all really well acted. I think it's very well written. I love the language here. But for reasons that we've talked about in other podcasts on Vagrant Story and Final Fantasy Tactics and all kinds of things. But I think it's beautiful. I think it's great. And I have absolutely no problems with it whatsoever. So
Me neither. And also, don't disrespect my ancestors by saying that the way that they talked was useless or stupid or superfluous.
Yeah.
That's how they were. That's how they talked, and it's sweet. All right, it's cool.
It is cool. Biblical language is really cool.
It's epic.
It's
It's cool.
very, very freaking cool.
Yeah.
Anyway, hope you guys enjoyed this. I'm sure we're going to have a very lively comment section here.
Yeah.
And we are open to counterpoints. Just
of course.
Understand that we're trying to come from a place of good faith here. And what I'm trying to do is make sure that we're not jumping to conclusions about the intentions of people who we have not spoken to first.
Right. Which
is always a pet peeve of mine. I hate when people do that to me.
Yeah.
So I hate to see people doing that to others too. It's just not. It's not a way that we all come to a greater understanding of each other, right? It just creates needless conflict.
If this can all be explained while simultaneously assuming the best intentions for the translators, right? Then to assume negative, bad intentions there's no reason to do that.
Yeah.
Right? There's no reason to assume that they're acting in bad faith when there's a perfectly reasonable explanation for why they're doing what they're doing, and that explanation does not require them being sneaky and acting in bad faith.
Yes.
Right. And which means, like, why not give them the benefit of the doubt?
Yes. Now I can see. I'm already like seeing in the comment section. So I'm seeing you typing. You maybe someone who's a Final Fantasy VII remake fan.
Yeah.
But didn't
Oh,
you do
localization.
that, Mike, with Final Fantasy VII Remake?
It depends. It's always different,
so
case by case.
My argument in defense of myself, without going back and rewatching every word I've said about it, would be that my critiques were to choices made not towards the people who made them.
Okay.
Not these idiots wanted to ruin my story that I loved,
Right.
and so they did this. That's a very different thing than saying, I don't agree
With
making this change to the story because I think it undermines the theme in this way.
Mm.
That's a disagreement about the choices in the art. It's not my assuming they wanted to destroy my childhood. You know what I'm saying? Like that's a very different way. There's a very different way of critiquing in which you can give constructive, honest, probably it can come across as being harsh, yet still it's feedback that's focused on the technical execution of something and not attacking the creators of that thing.
Right.
I think there are some examples in this guy's thread where he's doing the right thing. He's critiquing the technical translation here. And there are other times where he's calling them out directly and accusing them of something.
Of thinking that they're better writers.
Yes.
When they're just doing their job.
Yes.
And they're doing a really good job,
and
I have to say.
Yes. And so that's what I'm taking issue with here, not with his opinion that this translation would have been better, more accurate.
Yeah.
I don't agree that it's more accurate in certain circumstances. In others, I do. That's fine. That part, he's perfectly within his rights to do that.
Of course, yeah.
That's the distinction I want to make. Now we're done.
All right.
We'll see you guys next week. Peace out.